George Clooney. Just the sound of his name instantly evokes an era of silver screen glamour, effortless charm, and a kind of confidence that feels almost extinct today. For decades, audiences have turned to him not only for entertainment, but for the reassurance that true Hollywood grace still existed in flesh and blood. He wasn't simply a movie star, he was a living reminder of the elegance and wit once reserved for legends. With his silver hair, sharp smile, and magnetic presence, Clooney became the very definition of sophistication. As Dr. Doug Ross on ER, he wasn't just a doctor on a television show, he was the heartbeat of an entire cultural moment, the role that transformed him into a household name. Later, on the big screen, his performances in thrillers, dramas, and romantic classics would shape him into a global icon. He became the yardstick against which others were measured, the man who seemed to have it all. And yet, the George Clooney the world applauded was not the full story. Beneath the tuxedos, the red carpets, and the effortless banter in interviews, there was another reality, one marked by silent battles, deep scars, and a loneliness he rarely let the cameras see. A life that forced him to smile when he wanted to break, to charm when he longed for silence. Because behind every legend is a price. And the question that lingers is this: for all the glamour, all the awards, all the adoration, what did George Clooney truly sacrifice to become Hollywood's last great gentleman? Long before he became the silver-haired gentleman of Hollywood, George Clooney was simply a boy in Kentucky, surrounded by a family whose roots were steeped in charisma, artistry, and a touch of destiny. Born on May 6, 1961, he entered a world already buzzing with creativity. His mother, Nina Bruce, was more than just a beauty queen and city councilwoman. She was the picture of grace and resilience, a woman who carried both charm and determination. His father, Nick Clooney, was a charismatic television host and news anchor, a man whose booming voice and screen presence seemed to foreshadow the path George himself would one day walk. The Clooney household was no ordinary home. It pulsed with the rhythms of television studios, music rehearsals, and storytelling. His aunt, Rosemary Clooney, was a legend in her own right, a singer and actress beloved across America. To young George, she was living proof that fame was not just a dream, but something that could spring from family blood. And even deeper in his lineage was a distant connection to Abraham Lincoln, as though history itself whispered that greatness was never too far from reach. From the outside, it looked like the perfect foundation for success: a stable, loving family, a name already linked to talent, and a boy destined to shine. But appearances are rarely the full story. Even in such a vibrant household, George's journey was not immune to shadows. Because sometimes pain doesn't roar its way into your life, it seeps in quietly, reshaping everything before you're even old enough to understand what's happening. And for George, that shadow would strike just as he entered adolescence, altering not only his childhood, but the very way he would learn to survive in a world that worshipped perfection. At 13, just as most boys begin to crave belonging, confidence, and a sense of normalcy, George Clooney was forced into a nightmare that stripped him of all three. Out of nowhere, he was struck by Bell's palsy, a rare neurological disorder that froze the entire left side of his face. His smile twisted, one eye refused to close, and his reflection in the mirror no longer resembled the boy he had been the day before. For nearly 9 agonizing months, he lived with a paralysis that made every glance, every laugh, and every whisper from classmates feel like a cruel spotlight. For a teenager stepping into adolescence, the condition was more than medical. It was a devastating assault on his identity. Each day at school became a gauntlet. Some peers mocked him, some stared in silence, others avoided him altogether. The cruelty of children combined with the unbearable shame of his own reflection left George desperate to disappear. Years later, he admitted that he avoided mirrors altogether, terrified of the face that stared back at him. But it was within this darkness that Clooney discovered something unexpected, something that would shape the very essence of his future career. Humor became his shield. If he could joke about himself first, if he could make people laugh before they mocked him, then he held the power in the room. "You learn to be funny to survive," he would later confess. Comedy, in those moments, was not an art, it was camouflage. That instinct to disarm pain with wit hardened into a reflex, one that never left him. It forged the foundation of the Clooney persona the world would one day adore, the charming, quick-witted, easygoing man who seemed untouchable. But behind the sparkle of that humor still lived the scared seventh grader who had once hidden behind laughter because he couldn't bear to show the pain. Even as the paralysis eventually faded, the imprint it left on George never truly healed. The boy who once wondered if he would ever smile again carried that question with him into adulthood, not as weakness, but as a scar that taught him to survive. And it would not be the last time he would learn that survival meant wearing a mask. When the paralysis finally released its grip, George Clooney stepped back into the world with a face that could once again move, but with a spirit permanently changed. Determined not to be defined by weakness, he threw himself into sports. Basketball, baseball, anything that could prove to himself and to everyone else that he was strong, capable, and no longer the boy others had mocked. By high school, he was not just another kid on the team. He was a standout athlete, the kind of young man people began to notice for his skill and drive. In 1977, Clooney chased what felt like destiny: professional baseball. He tried out for the Cincinnati Reds, carrying with him not only a bat and glove but the weight of all the doubts he had been collecting since childhood. This was his chance to prove that he belonged, that he could rise above humiliation and turn pain into triumph. But fate had other plans. Clooney was cut in the very first round. No fanfare, no encouragement, just rejection. For a boy who had built himself back up, the sting was sharp, another reminder that life seldom followed the script of dreams. But George had already learned how to survive failure. He laughed it off, made jokes about striking out, masking the sting the same way he had once masked paralysis. Outwardly, he seemed unbothered, but deep inside, another scar formed. Once again, he had been told without words that he wasn't good enough. With no clear path ahead after high school, Clooney did what many young men in Kentucky did. He worked wherever he could. He cut tobacco in the fields under a punishing sun, his hands stained and calloused. He knocked on doors selling insurance, facing rejection after rejection, just as he had in Hollywood years later. He stocked shelves in small stores, moved boxes, and scraped together a living that seemed galaxies away from the glamour he would one day embody. Each job was humbling, but each job also built something inside him: resilience. The boy who had once hidden from mirrors now knew how to endure grueling days without losing hope. He learned to swallow disappointment without bitterness, to carry failure in one hand and keep reaching with the other. Clooney was no prodigy. He was persistence in human form. And though he could not see it then, every long day in those fields, every slammed door during insurance sales, every weary night staring at a ceiling with no clear future, was quietly shaping the man who would one day be adored for his confidence, unaware to the world that it had all been forged in sweat, rejection, and silence. By the time George Clooney set his sights on Hollywood, he carried with him a strange mix of resilience and uncertainty. He wasn't the golden prodigy destined to be discovered on day one. He arrived, like countless others, with a dream in his pocket and little else to fall back on. What made his journey different was not luck, but the relentless determination of someone who had already been told no too many times to count. His early years in Hollywood were not the glamorous fairy tale the public imagines. They were a carousel of disappointment. Clooney hustled for every audition he could find, only to land small, forgettable roles, bit parts in shows like The Facts of Life, Baby Talk, and Bodies of Evidence. These weren't star-making turns. They were filler. He was the background face, the extra line, the character audiences forgot as soon as the credits rolled. At times, life became so unstable that he relied on the generosity of friends, crashing in spare rooms and even sleeping in closets just to stay close to the city where dreams were supposed to come true. Hollywood was not waiting for George Clooney. If anything, it seemed to be shutting him out at every door. But he did not stop. He kept auditioning, kept walking into rooms where casting directors barely looked up, kept smiling through rejection that could have broken a weaker spirit. This was where his armor built in childhood and hardened by young adulthood proved invaluable. He had learned how to laugh at failure, how to hide the sting, how to use persistence as a weapon against despair. And so, slowly, one weary footstep at a time, Clooney carved his way forward. He wasn't discovered overnight. He forced Hollywood to notice him. For nearly 2 decades, his career was a slow burn, a steady climb with no shortcuts. Then came 1994, the role of Dr. Doug Ross on ER. Suddenly, the man who had once slept in closets became a household name. The charming, emotionally complex pediatrician wasn't just a character, it was the role that altered everything. Overnight, George Clooney transformed from a struggling actor scraping by into the face of primetime television. Women adored him, men envied him, and the industry finally paid attention. Later, Clooney would admit that he had been on the verge of giving up before ER. "That show saved me," he reflected. "I was broke. I was almost out of chances. ER gave me everything." But while the world fell in love with his charisma and confidence, few could imagine the truth. That charm was not effortless, it was armor, sharpened through years of rejection, loneliness, and quiet pain. When ER premiered in 1994, it wasn't just another medical drama, it was the cultural heartbeat of the decade. And at the very center of it all was George Clooney, playing Dr. Doug Ross. He wasn't the flawless hero doctors were often portrayed as. He was complicated, charming, flawed, and magnetic. Week after week, millions tuned in, not only for the gripping storylines but to watch Clooney's smoldering gaze and natural charisma command the screen. Overnight, the man who had been scraping by with forgettable roles was reborn as television's brightest star. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. He became the kind of household name that transcended the television screen, his image appearing on magazine covers, late-night talk shows, and endless fan posters. After nearly 2 decades of rejection, George Clooney was finally living in the blinding light of stardom. But even as the world swooned, Clooney himself understood a truth most did not. Fame was fleeting, and if he didn't make bold moves beyond television, he risked becoming just another forgotten television star. So he leapt fearlessly, and at times recklessly, into film. His choices were daring, and occasionally divisive. In 1996, he shocked audiences with the gritty, blood-soaked From Dusk Till Dawn, a vampire thriller that couldn't have been further from the polished halls of ER. A year later, he headlined Batman and Robin, 1997, a film that became infamous for its over-the-top style and critical backlash. Clooney himself would later laugh about it, calling it a waste of money. But even through failures, he was learning, sharpening his instincts, proving he could weather storms without retreating. By 1998, with Steven Soderbergh's Out of Sight alongside Jennifer Lopez, Clooney found his footing. Audiences saw a different side of him, suave, dangerous, and layered with intelligence. It was a role that reminded Hollywood that he wasn't just a pretty face, he had range, depth, and the courage to take risks. The true turning point came in 2001 with Ocean's 11. As Danny Ocean, Clooney embodied everything the public already believed about him: sophisticated, witty, effortlessly charming, and always one step ahead. The film was a massive box office success, spawning 2 sequels and cementing Clooney as not only a movie star but a cultural icon of his generation. Yet even as Hollywood embraced him as the ultimate leading man, Clooney quietly resisted being boxed in. He wasn't content with fame alone. He craved projects that mattered, stories that carried weight, substance, and, at times, political bite. This wasn't just ambition, it was survival. Because for Clooney, the applause of audiences could never fully drown out the echoes of his own doubts and scars. By the early 2000s, George Clooney had secured his place as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. But for Clooney, being a charming leading man wasn't enough. He had spent too many years clawing his way to the top to settle for superficial scripts that offered little more than box office returns. He wanted films that mattered, stories that challenged both him and the audiences who adored him. So, while Ocean's 11 and its sequels filled theaters with laughter and glamour, Clooney simultaneously began building a reputation for something far more enduring: serious cinema with political and emotional weight. His choices were bold, even risky, for a man who could have coasted on looks and charisma alone. In Syriana, 2005, Clooney completely transformed himself, gaining weight, growing a beard, and diving into the brutal complexities of Middle Eastern politics. The performance was so powerful, so visceral, that it earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. But he didn't stop at acting. With Good Night and Good Luck, 2005, Clooney stepped behind the camera to direct and co-write a film that tackled the clash between journalism and political fear-mongering in 1952nd America. Shot in stark black and white, it was a love letter to integrity in journalism and a bold critique of power. Critics hailed it as proof that Clooney wasn't just a star, he was a storyteller with vision. The film earned 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Director and Best Screenplay for Clooney himself. He followed with Michael Clayton, 2007, a taut legal thriller that showcased his ability to convey moral conflict and quiet despair. Then came The Ides of March, 2011, another political drama he co-wrote and directed, exposing the cutthroat realities of American politics. These were not the safe, glossy films expected from a heartthrob. They were deliberate statements. Clooney was carving out a dual identity, both the box office draw and the conscience of Hollywood. To cement this mission, Clooney co-founded Smokehouse Pictures with his longtime collaborator Grant Heslov. Together, they championed projects that carried social and cultural resonance, stories that refused to shy away from controversy or moral ambiguity. It wasn't about escapism, it was about relevance. Clooney wanted films that could spark conversation long after the credits rolled. The accolades poured in: 2 Academy Awards, multiple Golden Globes, BAFTAs, and the kind of critical acclaim that placed him in the same breath as Hollywood's most respected figures. He was no longer merely the man with the silver hair and killer smile, he was an auteur, a leader, and, for many, the last great symbol of an actor who valued substance over spectacle. But with every standing ovation came a cost. For all his professional triumphs, Clooney's personal life was becoming more fragile. The very ambition that drove him forward was also leading him into a silent war with his own body. And soon, that war would nearly destroy him. In 2005, George Clooney should have been celebrating the pinnacle of his career. Syriana, the gritty political thriller, was shaping up to be one of his most important works, an uncompromising story that peeled back the layers of corruption and power. But instead of triumph, Clooney found himself plunged into one of the darkest chapters of his life. While filming a violent interrogation scene, he was tied to a chair and thrown backward. The stunt was supposed to be routine. Instead, something went terribly wrong. The impact tore the dura, the protective membrane surrounding his spinal cord, causing spinal fluid to leak. At first, Clooney thought it was just another injury, the kind actors often walk off. But soon, agony set in, a pain so severe it consumed every second of his existence. The headaches were crushing, the kind that blurred vision and made even the simplest movement unbearable. He couldn't sit, couldn't stand, couldn't find relief. At one point, the pain became so relentless that Clooney admitted he considered ending his own life. "You start to think in terms of, I can't exist like this," he revealed in a haunting interview years later. For a man who had built his persona on control and composure, the helplessness was devastating. Doctors struggled to diagnose the injury. Clooney endured weeks of misdiagnoses, endless treatments, and medications that offered little relief. On the outside, he still looked like George Clooney, the elegant, silver-haired star, but inside, his body was in full rebellion. He became withdrawn, skipping public events, sinking into depression as the pain persisted. Eventually, the problem was identified: a cerebrospinal fluid leak. Surgery followed, and though it saved him, the road back was long and brutal. Recovery meant grueling physical therapy, isolation, and the constant fear that the pain might never fully leave him. Clooney described the experience as being trapped in a body that no longer obeyed, a cruel contrast to the confident heroes he portrayed on screen. Yet, as with every hardship in his life, Clooney refused to let it define him. Slowly, with time and grit, he clawed his way back, but he didn't emerge unchanged. That ordeal forced him to confront his own mortality and re-examine what mattered most. Fame, awards, even fortune, none of it could protect him from suffering. Pain is the great equalizer, he reflected. Out of that crucible of suffering came a new George Clooney, a man who turned more deeply toward humanitarian causes, who lent his voice to those who had none. He had endured agony that nearly broke him, but instead of letting it hollow him out, he used it to sharpen his sense of empathy. For the world, he remained the charming icon. But for Clooney himself, the accident was a turning point. The moment he realized that even legends can bleed, and that surviving pain could become a legacy all its own. Long before George Clooney became the world's most celebrated bachelor, he believed in marriage. In the mid-1982nd, when he was still a struggling actor barely recognized outside of casting rooms, he met actress Talia Balsam. She was confident, established, and came from a respected Hollywood family. For Clooney, who was still fighting for his place in the industry, her presence was magnetic, an anchor in the uncertainty of his rising career. Their connection was immediate and passionate. In 1989, swept up in youth, hope, and the intoxicating promise of permanence, the two eloped in Las Vegas. Clooney later described the decision as impulsive, more about chasing the fantasy of stability than truly being ready for it. For a brief moment, though, it felt like a new beginning, like he could balance the chaos of his career with the comfort of a home. But reality crept in quickly. As Clooney's career began inching upward, he poured all his energy into auditions, networking, and the endless grind of Hollywood. He was rarely home, and when he was often distracted or consumed by stress. Talia, on the other hand, craved intimacy, presence, and a partner who could ground her in daily life. Their desires were painfully misaligned. Clooney himself admitted years later that he simply wasn't equipped for marriage at that time. He was consumed by ambition, too restless, too focused on survival. The young couple's home, instead of being a sanctuary, became a place of mounting tension and quiet disconnection. Clooney's body even began to revolt. He developed painful stomach ulcers, a physical manifestation of the stress he carried between career pressures and a faltering relationship. By 1993, the marriage collapsed. The divorce papers were signed quickly, but the emotional scars lingered. Clooney never publicly blamed Talia. In fact, he often shouldered the responsibility, openly confessing, "I wasn't good at it. I wasn't someone who should have been married at that point." The fallout from that failed marriage cut deeper than he ever admitted at the time. It wasn't just a breakup, it was a personal reckoning. Clooney walked away not only with regret but with a conviction that he was not built for lasting commitment. In the years that followed, he doubled down on that belief, telling friends, fans, and interviewers alike that he would never marry again. For over 2 decades, that declaration defined him. It wasn't just a throwaway line, it was a shield. He built an identity around it, embracing the role of Hollywood's eternal bachelor, always charming, always desired, but never tied down. To the outside world, he seemed untouchable, enviable even. But behind the carefully constructed image was a man still carrying the ache of a marriage that had left him questioning whether love was ever truly meant for him. The story of George Clooney, the bachelor icon, began not with Playboy glamour, but with heartbreak, a scar left by a love that failed too soon. After his divorce from Talia Balsam in 1993, George Clooney stepped into a new identity, one he would carry for more than 20 years. He wasn't just single. He was Hollywood's most eligible bachelor, the man every magazine fawned over, the heartthrob who could have anyone but chose no one. The image was intoxicating. The handsome star who seemed perfectly content with fleeting romances, fast cars, and a life free from the chains of commitment. Hollywood ate it up. Clooney's bachelor status became as much a part of his brand as his salt and pepper hair and sly grin. He dated high-profile women whose names filled tabloids around the world: British model Lisa Snowdon, Italian actress Elisabetta Canales, WWE star Stacy Keibler. Each relationship played out in glossy photos on red carpets, fueling the mystique of a man who appeared to glide effortlessly through life. Twice he was crowned People magazine's sexiest man alive, as if to confirm what the world already believed. George Clooney was the epitome of masculine charm and freedom. But behind the flashbulbs, the reality was far more complicated. Clooney once admitted that there were nights when silence pressed against him so heavily it felt deafening. He had fame, fortune, and admiration. Yet when the parties ended and the lights dimmed, he often found himself returning to empty houses and empty rooms. What the world interpreted as independence often felt, to him, like exile. He masked it well. On interviews and late-night talk shows, he leaned into the persona, the witty, untouchable bachelor who could charm a crowd with a single line. When asked about marriage or fatherhood, he brushed it off with humor, deflecting with such ease that audiences believed he truly didn't want those things. "I don't think it's for me," he would say. And the world nodded along, never questioning the cracks beneath the smile. But Clooney's resistance to marriage wasn't born of arrogance or disinterest. It was born of hurt. The scars of his first marriage, combined with years of failed romances, had convinced him that lasting love was simply not meant for him. He had convinced himself that he wasn't built for it, that his destiny was to live adored but unattached. It was the cruelest irony. The freer he became, the lonelier he felt. He was the man who made millions laugh, but often fell asleep in silence. The star who seemed to have everything, except the one thing he quietly longed for: belonging. For over 2 decades, he carried that burden, letting the world believe he was content, even as his heart whispered otherwise. And then, when he least expected it, one chance meeting would unravel the identity he had so carefully crafted and prove to him that love, real love, had been waiting all along. By 2013, George Clooney had built his life into a fortress. He was admired everywhere he went, a global star with unmatched influence, wealth beyond measure, and the polished charm of a man who had perfected the role of Hollywood's eternal bachelor. He had long since declared that marriage wasn't for him, that fatherhood was out of the question. The world believed him, and so, in many ways, did he. But destiny has a way of dismantling even the strongest walls. That year, at his villa on Lake Como, a place of luxury and solitude, a mutual friend introduced Clooney to someone who would alter the course of his life. Her name was Amal Alamuddin. She was not an actress, not a model, not another figure from the Hollywood carousel. She was a human rights lawyer, a woman of extraordinary intellect, poise, and compassion. Unlike so many before, she wasn't dazzled by George Clooney, the movie star. If anything, she seemed almost unimpressed by his fame, far more focused on conversations about justice, human rights, and the global fight against oppression. And for Clooney, that was disarming. For once, he wasn't the center of attention. Instead, he found himself listening, captivated by her eloquence, her confidence, and her unshakable moral compass. In later interviews, he would admit, "I didn't know how unfulfilling my life was until I met Amal." It was a startling confession from a man who had spent decades convincing himself he needed no one. Their connection grew slowly, tenderly, through long, thoughtful emails that revealed more than either expected. Clooney, known for breezy romances, suddenly found himself checking his inbox like a teenager, waiting for her replies. The wit he had once used as armor now became a bridge his jokes matched by her sharp, playful intelligence. With every exchange, the fortress he had built around himself began to crack. Then came the moment that surprised even him. After just months of knowing her, Clooney bought a ring. The man who had sworn he would never marry again, who had built an entire public identity around bachelorhood, found himself down on one knee in the intimacy of his home. He later joked about how agonizing the proposal felt, how Amal sat in stunned silence for 20 minutes while he nervously planned how to blow out the candle if she said no. But she didn't. She said yes. That yes was more than an agreement to marry. It was a turning point in George Clooney's life. It was proof that the heart he thought was beyond repair could still believe in forever. The man who once laughed off the idea of commitment was suddenly filled with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. From that moment on, George Clooney was no longer just Hollywood's most eligible bachelor. He was a man reborn, finally willing to risk love again, because he had found someone who wasn't impressed by his fame, but who truly saw the man behind the mask. On the 27th of September, 2014, the city of Venice seemed to pause. Gondolas slid gracefully across the moonlit canals. Ancient palaces glowed beneath chandeliers. And for one extraordinary weekend, the world's gaze turned toward George Clooney, not for a movie premiere, not for a red carpet appearance, but for something far more intimate. The man who had spent over 2 decades insisting he would never marry again was preparing to say, "I do." The venue was the Aman Canal Grande, a 16th-century palace brimming with history and elegance. But no amount of grandeur could outshine the meaning of the day. For George, this wasn't about spectacle. It was about surrender, about finally opening his heart fully to a woman who had rewritten everything he believed about love. Amal Alamuddin arrived like poetry in motion, dressed in a custom Oscar de la Renta gown that seemed to shimmer with both grace and conviction. As she walked toward him, all the bravado that Clooney carried so easily in Hollywood melted away. In that instant, the famously confident movie star looked simply like a man in awe of the woman before him. His classic Giorgio Armani tuxedo couldn't disguise the tremble in his voice or the tenderness in his eyes. The guest list reflected 2 worlds colliding: Hollywood legends like Matt Damon, Cindy Crawford, Bill Murray, and Bono mingled with diplomats, human rights advocates, and close colleagues from Amal's legal circle. It wasn't just a celebrity wedding. It was a gathering of minds, talents, and hearts from across the globe, all there to witness something many had thought impossible: George Clooney surrendering to love. The ceremony itself was striking in its simplicity. There were no tabloid stunts, no over-the-top declarations. Instead, there was stillness, a reverence in the room, as George vowed to be not just a husband, but a partner, a friend, a family. Amal, composed yet radiant, spoke words that brought tears even to eyes hardened by years in the spotlight. It was not a performance for cameras. It was real, raw, and sacred. After the vows, the celebration continued with vintage wine, Italian cuisine, and the kind of laughter only true joy can produce. Clooney, who had once sworn he wasn't made for marriage, found himself basking in the glow of the very thing he thought he'd never have: belonging. Later, reflecting on the night, he admitted that for the first time in decades, he felt completely at peace. To the world, it was the wedding of the decade, an event splashed across every magazine and dissected in every headline. But to George, it was something far simpler and infinitely more profound. It was the day he stopped running, the day the eternal bachelor laid down his armor and chose, without hesitation, the one person who made forever feel possible. Fairy tales usually end at the wedding, but for George and Amal Clooney, the ceremony in Venice was just the beginning of a much more complicated story. Love had brought them together, but now they had to build a life in the midst of 2 extraordinary, demanding careers. George was still one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, traveling constantly for filming, premieres, and humanitarian projects. Amal, meanwhile, was a world-renowned human rights lawyer, splitting her time between London and international courts, often immersed in high-stakes cases that carried global consequences. The distance between them wasn't just emotional, it was physical and relentless. At times, it seemed their marriage was a balancing act stretched across continents. But from the start, they had made a promise, never to spend more than a week apart. It was a vow easier said than done. Missed calls, hurried flights, and quiet nights alone became part of their reality. Still, they clung to their pact, each sacrifice a declaration that what they were building together mattered more than convenience. George began to shift his priorities. He chose scripts more selectively, trimmed down his directorial projects, and started structuring his schedule around time at home. For a man who had once been consumed by ambition, it was a dramatic change, a clear statement that Amal came first. Amal, too, found ways to anchor her demanding career to their shared life. When she could, she traveled with George. When she couldn't, she made homecomings sacred. Their homes themselves became symbols of their determination to stay connected. Villa Oleandra, at Lake Como, their estate in Berkshire, their house in Los Angeles, each one wasn't just a luxury retreat but a sanctuary, a place to retreat from the glare of the public and simply exist together. In interviews, George often said, "We make it work because she's worth it every mile, every hour." But even the strongest love is not immune to pressure. By 2024, as Clooney prepared for his Broadway debut in Good Night and Good Luck in New York, while Amal remained in Europe with their children, the tabloids pounced. Headlines screamed of trial separations, whispers of a $500 million divorce. The world, so eager for scandal, tried to turn their commitment into spectacle. Yet George and Amal refused to play along. George stated plainly, "We still love and respect each other. Nothing has changed." Amal, ever composed, continued to appear at his side at events and support him quietly behind the scenes. Together, they reminded the world of a truth most forget. Extraordinary lives do not protect you from ordinary struggles. Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better, two people choosing, again and again, to stay. In their differences, they found balance. In their distance, they discovered patience. And in their love, they found the strength to endure. Behind the glamour and headlines, theirs was not the story of perfection, but of perseverance. For decades, George Clooney had laughed off the idea of children. He told interviewers it wasn't for him, that he wasn't built for fatherhood. The image of the charming bachelor seemed complete without a family, and the world believed it. Clooney himself believed it until June 2017, when everything he thought he knew about his life was upended in an instant. At 56 years old, George became a father. Amal gave birth to twins Ella and Alexander at London's St. Mary's Hospital. And in that moment, Clooney's carefully curated existence shattered and reassembled into something entirely new. He later admitted, with a mixture of awe and disbelief, "I didn't see myself as a father. I just never imagined it for me." But the second he held his children, all of that changed. The man who had once commanded Hollywood film sets now found himself memorizing lullabies, fumbling through diaper changes, and waking up for late-night feedings. Clooney joked about being an older dad, showing up at preschool looking like a grandpa. But beneath the humor was something deeper, a tenderness the world had rarely seen in him. He was no longer simply the silver-haired icon of Hollywood. He was Dad. Fatherhood humbled him. Friends noticed how he turned down major projects, sometimes passing on blockbuster roles, in order to stay close to home. He had spent years chasing scripts, premieres, and accolades, but now he spent his mornings flipping pancakes for Ella and riding bikes with Alexander. He and Amal were fiercely protective of their children, refusing magazine offers for staged photo shoots and keeping their lives as private as possible. But being a parent also came with fear. When Alexander was diagnosed with asthma, Clooney and Amal became even more vigilant. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they shut themselves off completely, isolating to protect their son's fragile lungs. The glamorous Clooney household became, for months, just like any other family, filled with cooking, cleaning, board games, and pillow forts in the living room. For George, those simple rituals weren't ordinary, they were sacred. You stop thinking about yourself, he explained. Every decision becomes about them. It's terrifying, and it's the most beautiful thing. Clooney's sense of humor never left him. He often laughed about being overwhelmed by twins. One? Sure, but two? I didn't know what hit me, he said. Yet behind the laughter was pure pride. He once shared, with a sparkle in his eye, that his twins spoke fluent Italian, a language neither he nor Amal spoke. They conspire against us in Italian, he joked. It was moments like these, small and intimate, that defined his late fatherhood. For Clooney, fatherhood wasn't an afterthought. It was a revelation. The man who had once thought he had everything, fame, money, respect, discovered that true wealth was found in bedtime stories, tiny giggles, and the quiet joy of belonging. At 56, George Clooney didn't just become a father. He became a man anchored in love he never thought he deserved, and a legacy no award could ever match. By his mid-60s, George Clooney had reached a point in life that few Hollywood stars ever truly find peace. The once relentless bachelor, the man who seemed to thrive on the chaos of sets, premieres, and global attention, had chosen a new rhythm. Fame still lingered. Of course it always would, but it no longer defined him. Today, Clooney's world revolves less around flashbulbs and more around breakfast tables, bike rides, and laughter echoing through his homes. Much of his time is spent at Villa Oleandra, his beloved estate on Lake Como. To outsiders, it's a stunning $100 million property with manicured gardens, a private dock, and breathtaking views of the Italian waterway. But to George, it's far more than luxury, it's memory. It was here, in this lakeside retreat, that he first met Amal in 2013. It's where their love quietly began, and where their children now chase each other through hallways filled with history. He often calls it his little piece of paradise, a place where the noise of Hollywood fades away, replaced by the sound of clinking glasses at dinner with friends or the soft giggles of his twins. When school is in session, the family spends much of their time in their 17th-century mansion in Berkshire, England. Nestled in the countryside, complete with a tennis court, home theater, and sprawling gardens, it offers Clooney something he once never thought he'd value: routine. School drop-offs, quiet walks, evenings by the fireplace, ordinary moments that, for a man who lived decades in the spotlight, feel extraordinary. Even his Los Angeles home, purchased back in 1995, has shifted in meaning. Once a bachelor's haven, it now serves as a place of family connection, a reminder of how far he's come. Clooney has other properties in the US and Mexico, but the truth is simple. Home isn't about walls or square footage anymore. It's wherever Amal and their children are. His lifestyle reflects this shift. Health remains a priority, especially after the lingering pain of his Syriana injury. Though the worst of that ordeal has passed, Clooney still deals with chronic discomfort. He avoids heavy physical strain, but instead has embraced a gentler, mindful way of living. He rides bikes along the winding Lake Como roads, gardens, cooks with Amal, and eats a Mediterranean diet tailored to wellness. He rarely drinks, doesn't smoke, and jokes, "I don't go to the gym, I work out by loving life slowly." Professionally, Clooney has not vanished, but he chooses his projects with great care. Each new role, each directorial effort, feels deliberate, infused with purpose rather than ambition. In recent years, he starred opposite Julia Roberts in Ticket to Paradise, 2022, charming audiences with the kind of effortless ease only he can deliver. In 2023, he directed The Boys in the Boat, a story of resilience and teamwork during the Great Depression, a narrative that mirrored values he has long championed. He remains a powerful figure in Hollywood, but one who no longer chases relevance. He avoids social media entirely, rarely gives interviews, and seldom appears in gossip headlines. Instead, his public appearances now center on meaningful causes, human rights summits, freedom of the press events, and forums dedicated to justice. Always, Amal is at his side. Financially, Clooney has secured a fortune most can only dream of. His net worth, sits comfortably between $500 million and $600 million, much of it from the billion-dollar sale of his Casamigos tequila company in 2017. But he insists that money is not the legacy he wants to leave. "I don't want my kids growing up thinking money is the goal," he explained. "I want them to inherit values, not just wealth." For George Clooney, life today is not about applause, it is about alignment. The glamour is still there, but it no longer rules him. He has become, above all else, a husband, a father, and a man who has chosen love, family, and integrity over the shallow pursuit of fame. The silver-haired gentleman of Hollywood has not faded. He has simply found a quieter light, one that shines even brighter in the spaces away from the cameras. If George Clooney's story had ended with Hollywood stardom, it would already have been remarkable. But in the later chapters of his life, something even more profound has taken shape. The transformation of a movie star into a global advocate for justice. Together with Amal, George has woven his fame into something larger than himself, building a legacy not of red carpets, but of compassion, courage, and change. In 2016, George and Amal co-founded the Clooney Foundation for Justice. Its mission was ambitious yet deeply human to fight injustice in courtrooms, classrooms, and communities across the world. This was not a vanity project with a celebrity's name slapped on it. It was a living, breathing extension of their values. Amal brought her expertise as a world-renowned human rights lawyer, having defended persecuted journalists and political prisoners. George brought his platform, his influence, and his resources. Together, they became a team whose impact reached far beyond Hollywood. One of their flagship initiatives, Trial Watch, works to monitor trials around the globe, shining a light on governments that silence dissent, target minorities, or strip journalists of their freedom. In countries where corruption thrived in secrecy, suddenly the world was watching. Clooney, once known for captivating audiences with his smile, now lent his voice to those who had been silenced. Their foundation has poured millions into rebuilding war-torn schools, providing education to refugee children in Lebanon, Sudan, and Syria, and supporting victims of war crimes. George has stood at the United Nations and in global summits, not as an actor promoting a film, but as a man condemning violence, authoritarian regimes, and political corruption. For audiences used to seeing him in Armani tuxedos on the red carpet, it was jarring and inspiring to see him instead in sober suits, speaking about freedom of the press or the suffering of displaced families. The impact was powerful because it was personal. Clooney's own journey, his struggles with pain, loneliness, and survival, gave him empathy that felt real, not performative. And Amal was not just the woman who changed his view of love. She was the partner who redefined his purpose. Together, they showed the world that celebrity and activism need not be shallow, but could form a union capable of moving mountains. For George, this stage of life was never about applause. It was about using the platform he had built over decades to amplify voices the world might otherwise ignore. Fame, he realized, was not the prize, it was a tool. And in Amal, he found both the love he thought he'd never deserve and the ally who helped him turn charisma into conviction. In a culture obsessed with celebrity scandal and gossip, the Clooneys stand apart as a couple whose greatest legacy is not glamour, but justice. And for George, that transformation may be the most meaningful role of his entire career. George Clooney's story is not just the tale of a Hollywood star, it is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. From a seventh-grade boy hiding his paralyzed face behind forced laughter, to a young man cut from baseball tryouts and working tobacco fields under the Kentucky sun, to a struggling actor sleeping in friends' closets, his journey was never paved with ease. Every step forward was carved out of rejection, humiliation, and pain. And yet, each hardship built a layer of strength that later allowed him to stand tall in the brightest of spotlights. On screen, Clooney became the embodiment of charm and sophistication, the doctor who saved lives, the con man who outsmarted everyone, the leading man who defined an era. But behind that effortless smile was a survivor, A man who knew intimately what it meant to be dismissed, mocked, and broken. His charisma was never just natural. It was forged as armor. And that is why it connected so deeply, because beneath the shine was humanity. In his personal life, too, Clooney's path was one of reinvention. His first marriage collapsed under the weight of ambition and inexperience, leaving him convinced that he was not built for love. For more than 2 decades, he wore bachelorhood as both a brand and a shield. But just when the world had fully accepted him as the eternal playboy, love found him again in the form of Amal. With her, he discovered not only companionship but transformation, the ability to trust, to commit, to build a family he once swore he would never have. Fatherhood at 56 reshaped him in ways no film role ever could. For all the accolades, the Oscars, the magazine covers, nothing compared to the giggles of Ella and Alexander or the quiet nights of storytelling at home. In his children, Clooney found not just joy, but a legacy that transcended wealth or fame. And yet, perhaps his most enduring contribution lies beyond Hollywood, or even family. Alongside Amal, he has turned his platform into a force for global justice fighting corruption, defending the silenced, and reminding the world that fame, when paired with purpose, can be more than self-indulgence. It can be salvation for others. At 64, George Clooney no longer chases the applause of strangers. He no longer needs the validation of opening weekends or the fleeting thrill of headlines. His legacy is already written in the roles that defined a generation, in the love that defied his own fears, and in the causes that carry his voice far beyond the silver screen. The boy who once hid from mirrors became a man the world could not look away from. The actor who thought he wasn't built for love became the husband and father who built a home filled with it. The star who nearly lost his life to pain chose to dedicate his life to purpose. George Clooney's story reminds us that even icons bleed, even legends break, but that the true measure of greatness is not perfection, it is persistence, compassion, and the courage to keep rising. And so, the silver-haired gentleman of Hollywood endures not just as an actor, not just as a star, but as a symbol of what it means to turn pain into hope and fame into legacy. George Clooney's life today stands as proof that true legacy is never built solely on applause, red carpets, or box office success. It is built on how one chooses to rise after being broken, on the willingness to turn private scars into public purpose, and on the courage to redefine oneself long after the world has already written the script. For Clooney, the story began with adversity Bell's palsy in his teenage years, rejection after rejection in Hollywood, and a failed first marriage that left him convinced he wasn't made for commitment. Yet, each of these moments that might have destroyed another man became the crucibles that shaped him. They taught him resilience, humor in the face of humiliation, and the quiet strength to survive loneliness. Those lessons became the hidden fuel behind the effortless charm that captivated millions. But the true arc of Clooney's story lies not just in his survival, but in his transformation. He was the bachelor who once swore off marriage, only to find in Amal the kind of love that redefined his existence. He was the Hollywood icon who once claimed fatherhood wasn't for him, only to discover in Ella and Alexander the deepest joy and purpose of his life. He was the actor who nearly lost everything to pain on the set of Syriana, only to return from that abyss with a renewed commitment to use his voice for those suffering far greater injustices. With Amal by his side, Clooney has become something rare in Hollywood, a man who has turned celebrity into service. Through the Clooney Foundation for Justice, he has extended his reach far beyond cinema screens, helping to protect journalists, defend political prisoners, and rebuild shattered schools. Fame gave him a stage, but he chose to use it not for himself, but for the countless unheard voices of the world. And in the quieter spaces, away from the cameras, he has embraced the simplicity he once thought impossible, cooking breakfast with his children, bike rides by the lake, evenings spent reading by the fire. The man who once lived for applause has learned that true fulfillment comes not from the roar of strangers, but from the laughter of family. George Clooney's journey is more than a celebrity's biography. It is a story of what it means to endure, to evolve, and to ultimately find light after shadows. He reminds us that even the most admired icons carry invisible battles, but it is how they confront those battles that defines their greatness. As the red carpets fade and the headlines move on, Clooney's legacy remains clear. He is more than Hollywood's last gentleman. He is a survivor, a husband, a father, and a voice for justice in a world that desperately needs it. The boy who once wondered if he would ever smile again has given the world countless reasons to smile. And in doing so, George Clooney has ensured that his light, quiet, steady, and profoundly human will endure long after the cameras stop rolling.